Alright. I'm up, boy. Calm down, I muttered, laughing as Zeus launched himself onto the bed. I pushed him off groggily, asking if he wanted to go outside. He dashed to the back door, spinning in circles, waiting impatiently for me to open it. I'll admit, when we first got Zeus, I was nervous. A deaf dog? I had no idea what to expect, never having cared for a disabled pet before. But Ash convinced me to give him a chance, and I'm glad I did. I love him more than I ever thought possible. There's something about the fact that he'll never hear me tell him how much I love him, that I have to show him through my actions, that makes my bond with him even deeper. A bark from the back door broke my thoughts. Zeus's way of telling me he'd finished his business and was ready for breakfast. When I opened the door, he bolted in, sliding across the hardwood floors on his wet paws. It must have rained that morning. He paused, drenched, looking back at me with a mischievous glint. I knew exactly what was coming. Zeus, don't you fucking... damn it, man. I guess I needed to change anyways. God, it's like you don't listen or something, I complained as I went back to my room to grab some fresh, non-soaked clothes. All the while, Zeus happily soaked the mudroom. Once Zeus was dry, I topped off his food and water, then headed to the kitchen for a quick bite. I couldn't help but think of how proud I was of how Ash had trained him. If only she were here now to see him as a grumpy old dog. God, I missed her. Zeus was all I had left of her now. His days were getting harder, too, though he still had the spirit of a puppy. I grabbed some coffee and a bagel, sat on the couch and put on a random show. I wasn't really watching, just letting it play while my thoughts drifted. Zeus's head perked up and tilted as though he'd heard something, his eyes drawn to the hallway that led into the living room. Somehow, Zeus always knew when she was near, when she was going to appear and where she would appear from. As if, while I couldn't hear Ash as she went throughout her day, Zeus could. He always watched her with wonder, occasionally sliding down off his spot beside me on the couch and walking over to lay at her feet, following her wherever she went. I watched as Ash walked into the living room, her blue eyes glowing in the sunlight streaming through the windows. I wanted so badly to reach out to her, to brush her hair from her face, to feel her smile just before we kissed, to share one last flirty glance, but I knew it was pointless. I'd tried before, more times than I'd like to admit. I just had to watch as the memory played out. I remember when this first started, I had hated it. I got so angry that I went into a fit of rage and tried to do everything to get her attention. I cried, screamed, broke everything around me, tried to grab her and shake her, screaming for her to just look at me. But my hands just went right through her. I wasn't sure why this was happening or what it was, whether it was a schizophrenic episode or just some kind of magic, I don't know, but over time, I started to just accept it. In the beginning, I was at my lowest. Losing Ash to a tumor we caught too late left me drinking daily to numb the pain. I spiraled, lost my job, lived off unemployment, and eventually settled for a work-from-home position that let me keep drinking. A year into this haze, the visions began. One morning, with a bottle of Jack and leftover pizza in hand, I turned and saw her walk into the room. Healthy, radiant, alive. I stumbled, collapsed to the floor, and sobbed uncontrollably, the sight a brutal reminder of all I'd lost. Zeus climbed into my lap, pressing himself against me as if he understood my grief, his own silent mourning for her palpable. I held him tightly, both of us clinging to each other. When I finally looked up, she was gone, and I convinced myself it was just exhaustion and alcohol playing tricks on me. On the second morning she appeared, I was already drunk and sitting on the couch with Zeus watching TV, when, without warning, Zeus's head perked up once again, eyes and ears swiveling to face something. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that he was staring intently at the hallway that led from the bedroom to the living room and the dining room area, and saw a flash of movement coming from the doorway. I looked over, and to my horror, there she was again. Messy hair, oversized band t-shirt, and those eyes. A steely gray in the morning, but the second the sunlight hit them, as blue as the sky on a rainy day. I watched, incredulous, as she went about a normal morning routine, first walking to the mudroom and motioning as if opening the back door, watching what I could only assume was Zeus go out for his morning routine. walking into the kitchen and grabbing a glass of water, then pulling herself up to sit on the counter as she drank it, thinking about what she was going to do that day. Finally, my voice caught my throat. I called out her name, but she didn't respond, didn't even look my way. I got up and walked over to her, still sitting on the counter, and tried calling her name again. But again, no response. No acknowledgement in any way. I got right in front of her, and finally, she perked up. As her eyes washed over me, her face lit up. She smiled and extended her arms, wrapping them around something I couldn't see, saying something I couldn't hear. It was only then that I realized she hadn't been looking at me. Well, she was, but not me. She was interacting with a version of me that I couldn't see. And that's when it clicked that she couldn't see or hear me at all, because she wasn't really here. At that realization, I felt betrayed. I felt angry. I'm not proud, but I grabbed an empty bottle off the counter and threw it at this visage, screaming at my mind for betraying me, for forcing me to relive what I had lost so few months ago. Again, I became a sobbing mess, falling to the ground, my back against the cupboard as I watched Ash talk to thin air. Her smile so radiant, her eyes so focused. Zeus plopped down in my lap, forcing himself on top of me to try and calm me down, whining as he did so, as if consoling me and mourning with me. He missed his mom as much as I did, but he did his best to stay strong for me, and I did my best to hold on for him. Once again, I buried my face in his chest as he continued to quietly whimper, crying with me. By the time I had lifted my head from Zeus's now tear-soaked fur, Ash was gone. I gave Zeus another hug and kissed his head, seeing the sadness in his eyes. I stood up, grabbed a treat out of the cookie jar on the counter, and tossed it to him, chuckling dryly as he failed miserably to snatch it out of the air, watching instead as it gracefully bounced off his nose, his eyes widening as he watched it go past his face as his body went the opposite direction. Finally, after scrambling to correct his trajectory, he got the treat off the ground, greedily chomping it down as I cracked the cap off of a new bottle of whiskey I had on the counter. It was going to be a long day after that. The events of that morning rattled me for the remainder of the day, and I tried to push it aside as I drank and watched TV, occasionally patting Zeus's head or tossing a toy for him after he'd dropped it in my lap. I remember being so angry still, even after hours had passed, and I'm not sure why. I had seen Ash again when she was healthy. I got to see her before her sickness. I got to see her before our life crumbled and slipped between our fingers, so why was I angry? All the pain and misery from when she was going through treatment resurfaced, seeing the change in her, watching her lose faith. I tried so hard to maintain optimism, but her condition just kept slipping, and there was nothing we could do. Eventually, after a few hours of wasting away on the couch, Zeus started pawing at the back door from the mudroom and whining, letting me know he had to go outside. Reluctantly, I got up, stumbling as I tried to find my footing, bracing myself on the arm of the couch before continuing towards the back door in a sloppy manner. I can't remember how much I had drank, but it was too much. I made it to the door and Zeus slipped his way out, making his rounds around the backyard, occasionally looking back at me as if to check and make sure everything was okay. And that was the last thing I remember before blacking out. I awoke with a start as Zeus frantically pawed at me and licked my face, at one point standing on my back as he did so to try and wake me. I sat up, and he frantically threw himself at me, damn near knocking the wind out of me. I pulled him in for a bear hug, trying to sober up and gain my bearings, looking around trying to figure out what had just happened. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that I had passed out in the back door, hitting my head on the porch and getting a nasty bump on my forehead, which explained the splitting headache. Well, that and the impending hangover, but I was no stranger to that at this point. By the time I got up, closed the door, and made my way back to the couch, I checked the time and realized I'd been out for a solid 10 to 15 minutes, hence the panic from Zeus. I felt awful putting him through something like that. I vowed to myself that I'd slow down the drinking, after this last bottle, of course. The rest of that night was a blur, honestly. I don't know if it was the bump to the head or the alcohol, or both, but The last thing I remember was petting Zeus and watching TV, then waking up the next day in my bed with Zeus whining next to me as I had slept in. We went about our usual routine, outside, breakfast, then sitting on the couch watching TV with my laptop doing minimal work. Only this time, I couldn't keep my eyes off the hallway. I was holding my breath waiting for her to walk through our bedroom door, and I didn't have to wait long. This was where the cycle began. Each day I would watch her go through her morning routines, sometimes even daily routines on the days she didn't leave the house. Hell, sometimes even when she did, I would catch her in public. I remember one day at the grocery store, I was standing in the cereal aisle debating between brands I didn't really care about when something caught my eye. A flash of familiar movement. Her stride, her silhouette. My heart stopped mid-beat. It couldn't be. Slowly, I turned my head toward the end of the aisle, and there she was, Ash. She was walking with the same purpose and grace she always had, a basket hooked over one arm. Her hair was tied up in that messy half-up, half-down bun she used to wear when she wasn't trying to impress anyone, strands escaping in that perfectly imperfect way. I followed and watched as she stopped in front of the produce section, reaching out to inspect an apple, and I felt my chest tighten. The world around me blurred, the hum of the store fading into a distant drone. I wanted to move, to say something, but my feet felt cemented to the ground. My brain scrambled for an explanation. This couldn't be one of my visions. It was too far from home, too out of place. The grocery store lights cast a pale glow over her skin, making her seem almost too real. For a moment, I thought about running to her, calling her name, but deep down I knew how this would end. She wouldn't hear me. She wouldn't see me. I took a hesitant step forward, unable to stop myself, my pulse pounding in my ears, my hand trembling as I reached out slightly, as though she might feel it from across the room. She tilted her head, inspecting the apple in her hand before placing it gently into her basket. That was when she paused. For the briefest second, her eyes darted in my direction. My breath hitched, my heart leaping into my throat. Could she see me? Was it possible? But then she turned away, the moment gone. My outstretched hand dropped back to my side, and the weight of reality settled on my shoulders. I watched her walk toward the checkout line, disappearing behind a wall of shelves, leaving me standing there like a ghost in my own life. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the empty space where she'd stood. It wasn't until someone bumped into me, muttering an apology, that I snapped back to the present. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the closest item to me, not caring what it was. The rest of the shopping trip was a haze. I kept scanning the aisles, hoping to catch another glimpse of her, but she was gone, just like always. For 9 months, our cycle continued, until one day, something changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Zeus noticed immediately. As Ash walked to the kitchen table with her glass of water and book, she froze mid-step, wincing as she pinched the bridge of her nose, a familiar gesture of fighting off a headache. Zeus whimpered softly, slipping off the couch and padding over to her, his head low, before lying at her feet in quiet comfort. His soft cries echoed the ache in my chest. I followed, crouching beside him and resting my forehead on the edge of the table. I glanced up at Ash, closer than I dared to be in a long time. Her eyes, always steady and radiant, held a flicker of unease. As I stood, she flinched ever so slightly, a movement so quick I almost doubted it, but it stopped me in my tracks. She turned her attention back to her book, and I retreated to the couch, my heart heavy with something new. The faint hope that, just maybe, she had seen me. Over the next few weeks, the changes became impossible to ignore. Ash's routine, once effortless and serene, were marred by fleeting grimaces, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass or turned the page of her book. The spark in her eyes was fading, replaced by a quiet pain that seemed to grow heavier each day. Zeus noticed it too. He lingered closer to her than usual, his presence an unspoken comfort. Then came the day I dreaded most. The one I wish I could erase but plays on repeat in my mind. Her morning had begun like all the others, her movements slow, more deliberate but still familiar. Then she left, her book abandoned mid-chapter on the kitchen table. Hours passed in a tense stillness, Zeus curled up by the door as if waiting for her return. When Ash finally returned, the sight that greeted me broke what little was left of my heart. Ash stepped inside, her face streaked with tears, eyes red and glossy. Her movements were stiff, pained as she crossed the room and sank into her chair at the kitchen table. The air felt thick, suffocating as she dropped her bag to the floor, buried her face in her arms, and began to sob. It was a soundless kind of grief, her shoulders shaking under the weight of her sorrow, her breath catching silently. I found myself sitting across from her, just as I had been that day. My hand instinctively reaching for hers, met by nothing but air. Still, I held it there, as if pretending could make it real again. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered words she'd never hear, trying to steady her in my own useless way. Watching her, so close yet unreachable, reminded me of how cruel time and fate could be. The next morning was hell. The harsh shift from peaceful mornings to the rapid decline in Ash's health was devastating, and it broke my heart having to see the hell she went through. The treatment was harsh on her. Towards the break of the first month, she was almost unrecognizable. Her thin frame so frail she had to take breaks when walking between rooms, occasionally bracing herself on the wall, sliding down and sobbing on the floor. One day, I watched helplessly as once again she found herself on the floor, sobbing and nauseous. Zeus got up and trotted over to her and plopped himself in her lap, as he'd done for me so many times before. I watched, stunned, as she wrapped her arms around him, stroking his fur and hugging him tightly. Bewildered, I shot up off the couch, and there it was again. I saw her flinch and glance quickly in my direction. I called out her name in desperation, but there was nothing. No reaction. The look of recognition disappearing from her face as soon as it had appeared. But something deep inside me held on to hope that she had seen me, even if for just a moment. After that day, her interactions with Zeus happened daily, whether it was gentle pats on the head as she passed him or curling up with him on the couch. It was as if he were connected to her. I could hear any time I saw her speak to him, raising his head and looking at her as she said and signed that he was a good boy. I still couldn't hear her, but to me it felt as if every day she was becoming more and more real. I noticed the subtle signs of recognition in her sunken eyes anytime I was around, catching small glances towards my direction as I went about my days, even catching her watching the areas I'd be in. Not necessarily watching me, but it was as if she could sense that I was there. It was as if our roles reversed, Ash becoming the observer, me becoming the observed. It wasn't until one day I sat across from her at the table, hand reaching out to hers as it rested on the edge of her book, that something finally changed. I saw as my hand reached hers, she flinched again, slowly lifting her gaze to meet mine. I couldn't believe it. She was looking at me. Not towards me, not the space I occupied like before, but directly at me. She said something, but still I couldn't hear her. I shook my head solemnly, gesturing towards my ears, and watched as her shaky hands lifted to sign something. I can see you. My heart leapt to my throat, tears welling in my eyes as my own hands shook as I tried to sign back. I asked how long she had been able to see me, and she replied saying not long. Zeus had noticed me first, and spent a lot of time on the couch until one day, she thought she'd seen a shape sitting next to him, but couldn't make it out. She then told me she wasn't sure why she was having visions of me when I was at work, and just chalked it up to hallucinations due to the treatment. This was where I had to make a choice. Do I tell her what's actually happening? Do I tell her that she's no longer here? Do I tell her how much Zeus and I missed her? Then she signed something that broke my heart. I'm not going to make it, am I? I broke down. I tried desperately to grab her hand, but my fingers fell right through, and I slammed my hand against the table and got up, pacing out of the room, stifling my sobs. I didn't know what to say. How can you tell that love of your life, regardless of if she's already gone, that she wasn't going to make it? I fought with myself, my heart breaking over and over as I paced. I didn't want to say anything, but I knew my actions were her answer already. I walked over to the side of the table where she sat. I began to cry as I tried to rest my hand on her thigh, only for it to sink right through. Her eyes fell back down to the table as she turned her hands, examining them, thin and skeletal. She got up and approached me gently, signing that it was okay, gesturing towards the couch. She tried to put her hand on my back, but we both watched solemnly as it flowed right through me. But I followed her suggestion and sat on the couch. She sat next to me, facing me with her elbow bracing at the head of the couch, knuckles pressed against her temple. Eventually, I signed that Zeus had missed her, pointing down towards him as he rested his chin on the couch cushion looking up at her, grief riddling his face. She signed back, asking if I could actually see him, and I nodded. A question rang in the back of my mind, and I asked how old he was. She replied that he was 8. With that came a sudden realization. Zeus had been connected to her from the start. That's why it seemed he could hear her, and sense her when she was around, and now, where I see 10-year-old Zeus, she sees 8-year-old Zeus, and that's why she was able to interact with him. I patted his head, and so did she, and for a split second, our hands made contact. Her eyes widened in shock as she looked at me, but as soon as she looked at me, our hands fell through each other once again. She signed, still bewildered, asking if I was really there, to which I nodded as tears welled up. She began fumbling, asking how, and I just shrugged. Told her what I'd been experiencing over the past few months, how I'd been able to see her for a while now, just watching. Told her how Zeus had done the same. I also told her that I think Zeus could hear her, so make sure to give him lots of love for me. She began to cry as I told her that she'd been gone for almost 2 years now, and that I missed her so much. She reached her hand out slowly, and I felt as it made contact with my cheek. I looked at her in shock, realizing she was doing the same, and quickly pulled her in for a hug, sobbing as I did so. Eventually, though, I felt her form fade away and we were back to no contact, as if we were both ghosts, unable to connect. I wasn't sure what caused the sudden change in everything. I figured it was likely her declining health, but I was just happy we could interact, happy that she saw me. We resorted to talking about how she was feeling, how scared she was, and, sadly, how lonely she felt. See, when Ash was first diagnosed, I buried myself in my work. I had to. I had to make as much money as I could to pay for her medical bills, to make sure she was getting the treatment she needed. I felt like I was doing the right thing, but when Ash told me how lonely she felt, it broke me. I realized how distant I was, how scared I was, but I never told her that. She told me it felt like I didn't want to be home, how lonely she was with Zeus and how hard it was on her. I remember sobbing and signing that I was sorry over and over, and she just shook her head solemnly, telling me that it was okay. This became our new routine. We would wake up, do what we needed to do, then talk, well, sign to each other, for hours. We started spending every moment together. We would both turn on the same thing and watch it on the TV, all the while catching up. I started to notice her physically getting worse, but the sadness was slowly leaving her eyes. She began telling me she was glad I was there, even if I wasn't physically. This went on for a couple more weeks, until we got to the end of the 11th month. That was when things got worse. I could tell she was slipping more and more. Even breathing pained her. She could barely move, but she still tried to sign as much as she could. It hurt watching her wither away like this, but at least I was there. At least I could make things easier. I tried my best to ease her mind, and I prayed, for the first time in my life, that Ash had this when I was at work. I hoped that somehow I was given a portal back to my Ash, connected only by our loneliness, given a chance to be there for her one last time. Slowly, I began noticing strange inconsistencies in my surroundings. Doors that once led to familiar rooms now seemed foreign, their contents shrouded in mystery. I couldn't recall the last time I had eaten or drank anything substantial, nor could I remember falling asleep or waking up. My days had become a blur of Ash's presence and the quiet comfort of her company. It felt like nothing else mattered as long as she was there. The hours we spent signing and simply existing together melted into days, and I cherished every fleeting moment. But something felt off. My body betrayed me in small, unsettling ways. I started to feel weaker, as if some unseen weight was pressing down on me. One day, as I pushed myself off the couch, my legs wobbled and stiffened beneath me, as though I were wading waist deep through tar. Each step was heavier than the last, and a faint, creeping realization began to settle in the back of my mind. This wasn't just fatigue. Something deeper was changing. Another thing I couldn't ignore was the cracks spreading along the walls and the ceilings. I couldn't remember when they had appeared, or how they had grown so large without me noticing. Had I really been so wrapped up in all of this? The house itself felt like a fading memory, its once familiar spaces dimming and withering, mirroring Ash's steady decline. Rooms I hadn't stepped into for days, or weeks, seemed to blur at the edges, their contents slipping from my mind, yet whenever Ash lingered, the air seemed warmer, lighter, as though she carried a fragile vitality that defied the crumbling world around her. One morning, as I stumbled into the kitchen, my feet feeling like cement blocks, I stopped at my tracks. The dining room table was set as if for a special occasion. Long-forgotten decorations adorned the surface, their colors faded yet carefully arranged. 2 plates sat opposite each other, their silverware neatly in place. Napkins were folded with the precision Ash always insisted on, and in the center of the table stood a sunflower, vibrant and fresh, picked fresh from the stand down the road just this morning. My throat tightened and tears welled to my eyes as I saw Ash sitting in her usual spot. She rose to greet me, awkwardly brushing her clothes as if trying to present herself at her best. Her hands moved in familiar yet pained signs. She said she hoped I'd liked it. It'd taken all morning. She figured it'd been so long, especially for me, since we'd had a date. I couldn't help but smile as I walked toward her. She looked radiant, healthier than I'd seen her in months. Her hair fell just right, her face carried that warm, glowing energy I had fallen in love with, but as I got closer, I noticed the edges of her image flickering. Just for a moment, I glimpsed the truth. Her gaunt, weary face, the sharp lines of her fragile body. It was as if she were trying to project her old self, willing herself to appear as vibrant as she had been. But the cracks in her illusion, like the cracks in the house, betrayed her. Still, I didn't care. Whether she looked healthy or not didn't matter. She was here. I sat across from her and felt the weight of my own exhaustion. I wasn't much better off, constantly aching, every step a battle to stay upright. The nausea, the weakness, I could barely fight them off anymore. But none of it mattered. Ash was here, and for now, that was enough. As I sat down, I noticed the faint aroma wafting from the plate in front of me. Eggs cooked just the way I liked them, paired with crispy bacon and a small heap of roasted potatoes. It was simple, but it hit me like a wave. I hadn't tasted Ash's cooking in how long? 2 years? My hands trembled as I picked up the fork, the memory of countless mornings together resurfacing with every small detail. The way she'd hum softly while flipping the bacon, the playful eye roll when I snuck a piece off the plate. I took a bite, and the flavor was so vivid it almost hurt. It was perfect. Exactly how she used to make it. My chest tightened, a lump forming in my throat as the warmth of the food spread through me. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, it was like nothing had changed. She was here, alive, standing by the stove as sunlight streamed through the windows. I could almost hear her laugh, that soft, airy sound that always felt like home. When I opened my eyes, the reality of her sitting across from me came rushing back. She was watching me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a small, knowing smile on her lips. I wanted to say something, but no words came out. All I could do was stare at her, my vision blurring with tears as I muttered, "It's just like I remember." Though she couldn't hear me, Ash signed back, her hands moving slowly as if the motion took effort. "I thought you might like it." There was a tenderness in her expression that broke me all over again. I wiped my eyes hastily, not wanting to waste another second, and took another bite. Each mouthful felt like a bridge to the past, a fleeting connection to the life we once had, but beneath the joy of tasting her food again, there was an ache. A reminder that this was temporary, that the cracks in the walls weren't just in the house but in the fragile world we had built together in this liminal space. I didn't know how long we had left, but for now, I savored every bite, every fleeting moment. We sat and talked for hours, but I could see her growing more tired with each passing moment. She tried to sign something, her hands trembling with effort, but they faltered and fell back into her lap in defeat. My chest tightened as the reality of her decline became impossible to ignore. Finally, desperate for some anchor in the drifting haze of time, I asked her what the date was. She looked at me, her expression weary but kind, and signed, November 12th. The air left my lungs. Tomorrow, just one day away, marked the anniversary of her passing. Tears welled up and spilled over, my body heaving with silent sobs as I tried instinctively to reach for her hand, but, as always, my fingers passed through hers, the emptiness cutting deeper than any blade. It felt as though the entire house mourned with me. The walls groaned under the weight of time, dust slipping from the cracks in the ceiling, settling like a shroud over us. The echoes of my cries reverberated through the empty halls, once filled with the vibrant memories of our life together. Now they were hollow, abandoned. I felt the cracks in my heart deepen, spreading with each shuddering breath. Losing her again, it would kill me. Ash tilted her head, her lips parting as if to say something, but no sound reached me. She raised her hands to sign again, slowly and with great effort, but stopped midway, her fingers trembling too much to form the words. Her frustration was evident, her brow furrowing as she clenched her fists, but then she forced a soft smile, as though trying to reassure me. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't bear to see her trying so hard to comfort me when she was the one fading. "Don't," I whispered, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. My voice cracked under the weight of my despair. "Please, just stay a little longer." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes meeting mine, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like she truly saw me. Like the veil between us had thinned so much it might finally break. Zeus, as if sensing the fragile connection, got up and rested his head on her lap. Her thin, trembling hand sank into his fur, and for the first time, I thought I saw her relax. "It's okay," she signed weakly, her hands barely moving. "It doesn't matter. Right now, I'm here." Her words, so simple and yet so devastating, pierced through me. I wanted to scream that it did matter, that every second mattered, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. I didn't want her to see how broken I was. For the rest of the day, I buried my grief beneath a fragile mask of optimism, forcing myself to smile whenever her tired eyes met mine. If not for me, then for her. My own discomfort, the nausea that twisted my stomach, the dull ache in my limbs that made every movement a struggle, was irrelevant. None of it mattered. All that mattered was being here, fully present for the moments we had left. I'd spent so much of our time together running, hiding behind work, distractions, anything to avoid confronting what I knew was inevitable. But not this time. This time, I stayed. I watched her with a quiet reverence, memorizing every flicker of her expressions, every tremble in her hands as she struggled to hold on to herself. The cracks in the house deepened, tiny streams of light spilling through like something was trying to break in, or maybe break us apart. Dust swirled in the air, catching the light like stars, and the air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest like a weight I could no longer ignore. But still, I didn't move. My body ached to rest, to collapse, but I fought it. I'd spent so much time failing her before, letting fear and exhaustion dictate my choices. Not now. Now, every ounce of strength I had left belonged to her. I would sit with her, hold her with my presence, even if I couldn't hold her with my arms. I would stay by her side until her last breath, even if it meant it would be mine as well. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. For the first time since all of this started, we decided we weren't going to sleep. There was an unspoken understanding between us. This might be our last night together, and neither of us wanted to waste a second of it. I was exhausted, my body weak and trembling, but I didn't care. Every ache, every wave of nausea was insignificant compared to being here, present with her. We settled on the couch, pulling a warm blanket over both of us, its frayed edges brushing against our legs. The soft hum of the TV filled the air, playing an old sitcom we used to watch together, but neither of us paid much attention to it. It was just noise, a backdrop for our silence. I found myself stealing glances at her, memorizing every detail. The way her hair framed her face, the slight quiver of her hands as she adjusted the blanket, the way her chest rose and fell with labored breaths. It hurt to see her like this, so fragile, so far from the vibrant Ash I remembered. The house seemed to share my pain, its creaks and groans growing louder, more mournful as the night dragged on. As the hours ticked by, I noticed her slipping deeper into her discomfort. Silent coughing fits racked her frame, her shoulders shaking as she pressed her hand to her mouth. She'd pinch the bridge of her nose, a familiar gesture I knew meant she was trying to stave off the pain. Her breathing grew shallower, each inhale a struggle, and I felt the cracks in my heart widen with every passing moment. I wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but words felt useless. Instead, I reached out instinctively, my hand hovering just above hers, wishing more than anything that I could hold it, feel her warmth one last time. Instead, I just watched her, feeling utterly powerless, yet filled with a bittersweet gratitude that I could at least be here, sharing this night with her. If she was fading, then I would fade with her. I still remember the day she died. She had stayed up the night before, coming to bed late, and then, that following morning, she was gone. I shook her, flipped her over, did everything I could, but she was unresponsive. I called EMS and they came and took her away, and I sat there with Zeus sobbing, unable to believe that she was really gone. That feeling of guilt washed over me once again as my hand connected with Ash's once more. I felt my heart leap into my throat as I felt her cold hand clasp mine. I looked up as Ash's eyes lit up, and I pulled her into a hug. The veil had lifted once again, and I wasn't going to let her slip away. Tears welled up in my eyes as I held her, for the second time since before she died, clutching her in my arms, praying that the veil didn't fall again. And it didn't. For the next hour or two, we held each other in silence. Zeus jumping up on the couch next to me and resting his head in my lap, whining softly. I think he knew what I didn't want to admit. I patted Zeus on the head, slowly stroking his fur as I held Ash once again, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt content. In that moment, all my woes and the discomfort that had been growing over the past few weeks seemed to melt away. The house finally settled, a warm glow washing through me. I gently ran my hand up and down Ash's back as an attempt to soothe her, tears welling in my eyes as her shoulders heaved with another silent coughing fit. Carefully, I stood up, lifting her off the couch and carrying her down the hall to the bedroom. The hallway felt longer than I remembered, each step slower than the last, the cracks in the ceiling glowing softly with a golden light as they stretched ever so slightly. The house seemed to hum faintly as I sat her down in the bed, her image flickering like before as I did. I slowly lowered myself to the floor beside the bed, my movements heavy and labored. Zeus lay down in front of me, resting his head in my lap, whining softly with a solemn, knowing look in his eyes. I stroked his fur as I sat there, my back propped up against the bed. My breaths were shallow, muscles aching with overexertion, a splitting headache brewing behind my eyes. I felt Ash's hand gently wrap around my shoulder, tense as it made contact. She tugged on my shirt to get my attention. I turned my stiff neck to meet her gaze. Her hands trembled as she signed to me, her eyes brimming with tears. "This is it." I nodded solemnly, taking her hand and resting it on my shoulder. I tried to sign an apology, but she stopped me, grasping my hand and shaking her head. With a quiet sigh, I laid my head on the edge of the bed, tears rolling softly down my cheek as I gazed at her frail figure. The faint light from the cracks in the house bathed her in a pulsing golden glow, synchronizing with the slow, steady heartbeat emanating from the house itself. "This is it," I said aloud, unsure if I was speaking to the house, to myself, or to Ash. She nodded slowly, a faint smile gracing her lips. She signed back. "I can hear you," resting her hand on my shoulder once more. I smiled weakly, gripping her hand, too tired to speak. We sat together in silence for several minutes, simply being. Neither of us spoke nor signed further. There was nothing left to say, no expectations to meet. We were wrapped in the dim glow of the cracks and the ever-slowing beat of the house. "I don't know if I can do this again, Ash," I murmured, my voice trembling. "I don't think I can keep going after losing you again. It feels like I died the first time I lost you. I just didn't know it until now. I missed you so much. Zeus missed you so much." My voice cracked as I paused, stroking Zeus's head as he whimpered softly. "It was so hard to adapt. I don't think I ever truly did. God, you should have seen me. I was a mess. I wish we had more time. I wish you had more time. You didn't deserve this. We didn't deserve this." Ash's hand caressed my cheek, tears streaming down her face as she looked at me. Her silent sobs rattled her frail frame. She signed over and over, "I love you, I'm sorry." I shook my head each time, saying it was okay, but it wasn't. The cracks in the walls grew wider, the house trembling as if mirroring my grief. I wished I could fight it, stop the inevitable, but I knew our time was nearly gone. The house felt like it was collapsing in slow motion, the room around us suspended in limbo, caught somewhere between life and death. Zeus lifted his head, looking around nervously, a low whine rumbling from his throat. His gaze was locked on the open door, but beyond it there was only darkness. The hallway, the rest of the house, it was all gone. The heartbeat of the house slowed further, the glowing cracks dimming with each pulse. I kissed Ash's hand softly, watching as her breathing grew shallow. Her chest rose one last time before falling still. The silence was deafening. I squeezed her hand tightly, clenching my eyes shut as tears streamed freely, silent sobs racking my body. The house shook violently, as if mourning with me, dust falling from the cracks above. Zeus whined again, but the sound seemed far away, distant. I felt him grow still, his trembling ceasing as the house's heartbeat slowed even more. Faint, but still there. The pulsing lights slowed as I took my final breath, the heartbeat growing fainter as I slipped into unconsciousness, fading as I felt my life slipping between the cracks, fading into the veil, the glow engulfing me in warm memories. Meeting Ash, going on dates, moving in, getting Zeus, proposing, getting married, buying a house, living happily. As I faded more, I felt my hand stroke Zeus one last time. "We're coming, my love."